Indigenous peoples of North America. We're going to talk about First Nations of the North today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Miss Bree. I'm an educator, a farmer, an illustrator, a singer, and a proud grammar nerd. Welcome to the farm school. Alright, so before we begin with our learning, we're going to learn about honoring the first stewards of the land. And this is very important. Okay? Long before the contemporary schools that you see now, like that you go to school in now, big modern cities with their skyscrapers and things like that, or even big, like modern agricultural farms with the tractors and things. Indigenous nations lived, worked, went to school, farmed here. All the things that we do now, they just did it in a different way. They had their own schools, their own cities, their own farms. They raised families here. They governed. They even cared for the land and the water. So a land acknowledgement is a small but meaningful way to recognize that history and remember that Indigenous communities are not gone. They're still living, leading, and preserving their cultures today. Land acknowledgements help us tell history more honestly, recognize Indigenous sovereignty, build awareness and empathy, connect learning to responsibility. But they shouldn't be empty words. They should inspire continued education, respectful language, and continued support for Indigenous voices. So this is an example of a land acknowledgement for my area where I'm at. I'm right in between the Kansas and Missouri border. So my land acknowledgement would say, we pause to recognize that the land beneath us has a deeper story, right? This region was once home to the Kansas people. In fact, the state of Kansas is named after them. The Osage, Missouri, Shawnee, Delaware, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi also lived, traded, and traveled here. These nations were not simply tribes of the past. They are sovereign governments today, with citizens, leaders, and communities. A land acknowledgement reminds us that history did not begin with settlers, and that respect requires both truth and action. It's not about guilt, it's about honesty. It reminds us that every place has a story. So when we learn the names of the nations who lived here first, we show them respect. And when we learn about their cultures, their challenges, and their achievements, we strengthen that understanding. Remember, respect begins with respecting the memory of the past. So let's learn about the Indigenous peoples of North America. Okay? So, way back before, more than 10,000 years ago, right? This land was already home to thriving nations, with prosperous cities, thoroughfares from all the way across the U.S., all the way across from the Arctic tundra to the deserts of the Southwest even. There was thoroughfares, there was highways, essentially. Not the highways that you think of now, but still, trade routes. Indigenous people shaped the land, built communities, and developed cultures that still exist today. So let's talk about who lived here first, right? So the word indigenous means originating naturally in a place. So Indigenous peoples of the North American region are the original inhabitants of North America. A lot of people will sometimes make a mistake and think that, other people discovered America or that it was found in, the 15th century, but it in fact was not. It was well established as a highly cultured, highly developed continent, multiple continents, way before any of that happened. Okay? So when we say indigenous, we're recognizing that these communities existed long before European colonization, and many of them still thrive today. So let's talk about how they even got here. So, tens of thousands of years before any written history, right? The very first peoples began a remarkable journey to the lands we now call the Americas. One of the oldest ideas scientists have is about a giant pathway that once appeared when Earth was very cold and much of the water was frozen into ice. This was called the Ice Age. Because the oceans were lower then, a huge stretch of land called Beringia, or the Bering Strait, connected Asia and North America. Beringia is the land bridge that actually runs under the current Bering Strait. So people following herds of animals and looking for new places to live could have walked across this land bridge into a brand new world. However, as scientists learn more, we've found evidence for several other options. So we might find that the story might even be more exciting and complex. Archaeologists have found evidence, like ancient sites in South America, that are way older than expected, suggesting that people may have arrived earlier than once thought, and by different paths. Some researchers think that early travelers may have used boats along the Pacific coast, moving from island to island or following rich coastal resources as they went, arriving in the Americas by water as well as by land. There's another rare idea that ancient people could have reached the Americas from the east across the Atlantic Ocean long, long, long ago. This idea is pretty controversial yet and not supported by most scientists, but it does show how curious people are about how the first Americans arrived. There's also the indigenous oral traditions, so each individual tribe and nation will have its own theory about how their people arrived, right? Some of them will believe that, they crossed the Beringia land bridge. Some people say that the Great Spirit created them to be the first people to live there. There's a bunch of different options, right? And no one can really say for sure because nobody was there that's alive now. But what we know for sure is this: the first Americans didn't just appear out of nowhere. They traveled long distances. They used what the world offered: land, sea, animals, and plants to guide their way. And just like indigenous communities today continue to share stories and knowledge, scientists continue to learn from the land, the sea, and the ancient clues that those first travelers left behind. The story of how people first came to the Americas is part of a much bigger story, one that includes the voices of indigenous communities who lived here long before scientific study, at least modern scientific study, and who continue to live, lead, and tell their own histories today. You have to remember, because the glaciers melted and the oceans rose, much of the evidence is hidden underwater or buried. So archaeologists are continuing to uncover clues about these journeys. So now let's talk about the cultural regions of the Americas and why we're only today talking about the North American section. So first we need to tackle the concept of Arctic and subarctic peoples. Okay, so in the far north, Inuit, Yupik, and many other peoples adapted to freezing temperatures, right? They built homes from snow, like igloos in the winter, hunted seals and whales, and traveled by sled. Survival required knowledge, cooperation, and respect for nature. However, sometimes Arctic peoples are discussed separately from the other indigenous peoples of North America because sometimes there's been evidence of closer cultural and genetic ties to other Arctic regions across the planet, and so scholars sometimes group them differently. But they're still Arctic people, and they're still in North America, so we're adding them in. There's three general broad cultural regions, okay? And that's developed by kind of climate geography and what's available. So we have Northern America, Middle America, or Central America, and South America. Okay, so today we're going to talk about North America. So who were the early cultures of Northern America, right? What makes them special? Well, the earliest known ancestors in North America are called Paleo Indians, or the Lithic peoples. They were nomadic, which means they moved from place to place. They didn't really have permanent homes. They hunted large Ice Age animals like woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths, and they gathered plants. They worked together in groups and used carefully crafted stone tools. They didn't have metal or wheels or farm animals, but they did use fire and domesticated dogs, and they had a deep knowledge of nature and survival. Now, these peoples hunted animals, as we talked about, like woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths, okay, and many other megafauna that was around. This required a lot of planning and teamwork and bravery, because you have to remember this would be like hunting an elephant or something that was even bigger than an elephant on the ground by hand with a couple of knives. It's not the same as it is now. So you have to imagine how brave they must have been. Now, hunting these large animals provided food, clothing, and tools made from bone and hide. When the climate warmed and many large animals went extinct, the indigenous peoples adapted again. And remember, adapted means they adjusted, they changed to fit what was available. One of the most famous tools from this time is called the Clovis point, a fluted, spear-shaped stone tool. These tools show advanced skill and craftsmanship. They were designed carefully to fit onto spear shafts. Even without modern technology and machines and things, early indigenous peoples were skilled engineers and inventors. Around 11,500 years ago, the earth began to warm. Many large animals disappeared. But instead of giving up, indigenous peoples adapted. They hunted smaller animals and gathered more plant foods. They developed new tools and strategies. Adaptation and resilience became central to survival. So now let's talk about the Archaic period. Oop, went one too far. Okay, so now we're talking about after most of the megafauna has passed. Okay, so during the Archaic period, which is 8,000 to 2000 BCE, people began settling in larger groups near rivers and lakes. Water provided food, transportation, and fertile soil. Communities developed seasonal homes and began forming trade networks with neighboring groups. This was a time of creativity and cooperation. New technologies emerged: grinding stones for processing seeds, spear throwers, also called atlatls, for hunting, smaller, more efficient arrow points. These trade networks stretched across long distances, sometimes, you know, thousands of miles, right? The Mississippi River system alone was over 2,000 miles long. Okay? These shells and stones and minerals traveled hundreds and thousands of miles between communities. And there were many, 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 many of these trade networks across the entire continent. These were not isolated groups, these were connected societies. Okay, just like, people in Washington state and people in Florida can manage to get to one another today, they could have done that back then. They had the same networks, they just had different types of networks. Okay, and there's a huge regional diversity during this time as well, right? So each region within that continent had different availability for what was available, so you had different resources. So that set the foundation for their individual agriculture and how their societies flourished. So now let's talk about agriculture and complex societies. So over time, many indigenous groups began farming. In areas east of the Mississippi River, crops like sunflower, squash, and amaranth were domesticated. Later, corn, or maize, became an essential crop. Farming allowed people to stay in one place longer and build more permanent communities. Agricultural societies like the Adena and the subsequent Hopewell cultures, subsequent means they came after, built impressive earthworks and burial mounds. They created gorgeous pottery, carved sculptures, and even crafted copper jewelry. These cultures show that indigenous societies were organized, artistic, and spiritually complex. So, for example, the Adena and Hopewell cultures that we're talking about right now were kind of towards the eastern part of the Midwest US, kind of around Ohio now, where Ohio is now. Okay? So just to kind of give you an idea. Next up, we're going to talk about Cahokia. Now, did you know that you can visit Cahokia mounds today? You can. So let's talk about it. This was one of the largest cities in North America before European contact. It could have had up to 40,000 residents at its peak, which is huge for back then. Massive earthen mounds were built for ceremonies and leadership gatherings. This reminds us that advanced urban planning existed in North America long before European settlers arrived. Cahokia is actually located just outside of St. Louis, Illinois. So it's actually very easy to access, and it's a really cool site if you guys get to go. It's pretty neat. Okay. Now let's talk about indigenous cultures. So we talked about how there's been cultures from the Arctic ice to the forests of the east, the deserts of the southwest, everywhere across the Northern American continent. There is indigenous nations that have developed, right, shaped by their environments. Each name on this slide represents a living nation, not just a historical group. These communities have their own governments, traditions, and languages. And this is only a very, very, very small sample. There are so many more nations across North America alone. Okay, so just like from the Arctic to southern North America, right? We've got, for some example, we've got the Inuit, the Yupik, the Cree, the Tlingit, the Haida, Coast Salish. We've got Lakota and Cheyenne and Blackfoot and Iroquois and Cherokee and Muskogee and Navajo and Hopi, and there's so many more. Okay, but you have to remember there are hundreds more indigenous nations that aren't listed here, right? Including nations and tribes that aren't even federally recognized, which is just sad that even today they're still not recognized by the government. But they're still a nation, right? And every nation has its own history, its own language, its own leadership, its own cultural traditions. Indigenous peoples are not just one group, right? They are many, many sovereign nations, and it's good to remember that. For example, we have the Mississippian culture, which was based, as you might guess, in the Midwest, yes. They came about around 1000 CE. They were a corn-based economy, right? So they focused mostly on production of corn. They had a very complex ritual life and many priesthoods. And later, they influenced indigenous nations that had been encountered by Europeans. On the opposite side, we have the Southwest, right? The ancestral Puebloans. They developed irrigation systems. Irrigation systems are like how you bring water to gardens and plants and things now. So the fact that they developed this thousands of years ago is amazing. And they built stunning cliff dwellings, which means like homes in the cliff. Some of these structures contained hundreds of rooms. Now, living in dry climates required a lot of innovation, right? It required a lot of thinking. And these communities mastered water conservation and architecture. They even farmed. It's pretty cool. So now let's talk about European colonization. and what happened. So in the 1500s or thereabouts, right, European nations colonized the Americas. One of the most notorious ones of these is Christopher Columbus, right? He went so far off course looking for India that he found a completely different continent and landed on the Americas and decided, oh, well, I was meant to hit India, so this must be India because I couldn't be wrong. And immediately called them all Indians. And to this day, they're still fighting that name. Disease, forced labor, and land seizure deeply harmed these indigenous communities. Okay, so basically, when all those people came over, they brought new diseases. They assumed that these people were, quote, savages, right? And so they just enslaved them and they seized their land. They took it from them. And it's just unfortunate. I mean, really, these people were thriving communities that just dressed differently and talked differently. So automatically, Europe decided, oh, they just don't know what's good for them. Now, different European powers had different goals. For example, Spain was more forced labor and missions, France was more trade alliances, England focused more on permanent settlements and land seizure, and then Russia really exploited the fur trade. But all colonialization disrupted indigenous societies. In the 1800s and 1900s, indigenous children were sent to boarding schools, completely meant to erase their languages and traditions. A lot of these kids had their hair cut short. They had forbidden, right? They had been completely forbidden to use their languages that were native to them. They couldn't follow any of their traditions. There was a lot of physical and emotional abuse that was common here. And this created a lot of long-lasting intergenerational trauma. Okay? These policies caused a lot of harm. And some families are still healing from those effects today. This wasn't that long ago. Now, despite colonization and hardship, indigenous peoples remain. Languages are being revitalized, cultural practices are being restored, sovereignty movements continue. Indigenous cultures are not only part of the past, they are living, evolving communities today. So, just to reflect on what we just covered, right? Indigenous peoples shaped North America long before colonization. They had agriculture, architecture, and ecology. You need to understand this history in order to understand the modern world, because that history has affected and shaped the modern world today. And there are over 1,000 distinct indigenous nations across the Americas, each with their own language, governance, and identity. So remember, do some research, ask questions, and learn. So here's some discussion questions to take with you today, okay? Why is it so important to learn and understand indigenous history from before colonization? Okay? How might history look different when it's told by the people who actually lived it? How did environment shape their cultural development? Right? What effect did that have on each individual nation? What can modern societies learn from indigenous land practices? What technologies or current practices developed by indigenous peoples still influence us today? What can we learn from their approach to land stewardship? And lastly, how does cultural resilience appear across regions, right? So, what does resilience mean? How can we show respect to indigenous communities today? And why is cultural preservation important? Also, I want to throw in one last thing that I forgot to put on the slide, and that is, how did colonization change indigenous communities? And why is it so important to talk honestly about Native American boarding schools and assimilation policies? So those are just some questions I want you to take with you and chat with, find a partner or a parent or a teacher and just discuss it. Say, hey, what do you think and why? Broaden your understanding. Thanks, guys, for coming. I really appreciate you coming, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.